We had an extraordinary time with the heads of delegations and the experts that we had focused on this discussion that we had in 2 rounds on the economy and the work and skills issues. And I think the way I would summarize the conversation was actually very energizing, but I'd like to make, and I'm going to look at my notes here, basically the roughly 8 points that came out of it, because I think this is a very rich discussion. The first point was made by almost every participant that we ought to be thinking about the opportunity side of all of this. It's quite easy to get down and depressed about AI's impact on work and the economy, but quite frankly, there's more opportunity than there is downside. So I think there's a very strong theme about opportunity, transformation, potential, contributions to economic growth and productivity. That was very, very strong. So that's point number 1. The point number 2 was interesting, and I think one participant put it in the form of the word brave, that we actually need to be brave. Governments, countries need to be brave. And the bravery point came in a couple of different ways. One was in terms of the kind of the ambition that countries should have about taking on the opportunities associated with AI, whether it's in terms of making bold investments, setting bold goals, setting goals to become a leader, or at least among one of the leading nations or countries. And as we heard from different delegations, there was some version of this ambition to want to lead in this movement towards taking advantage of these technologies. So that was the second theme. The third theme that came out quite clearly, and was actually quite interesting, this is the benefit of having the diversity of different groups in the conversation, was a few things that I would describe as but don't forget. So what was this about? The don't forgets were about the fact that, in one instance, don't forget that the opportunities and challenges for developing countries are quite different than they may be for advanced economies. Don't forget that, in fact, in this world where we're going to these scaled opportunities through platforms, there are often small instances, whether it's around languages, unique languages, that we shouldn't forget, because as we all rush to translate everything into English or whatever have you, what about small languages? The other big don't forget was the idea around, let's not forget that we're going to need to find ways to be diversive and also inclusive of everybody, particularly around gender, because this is a very, it's been at least historically a very male-dominated endeavor when it comes to AI and these technologies. So there are some very important don't forgets. And there's some great examples, by the way, of things that some countries are already doing to tackle these gender diversity issues and other diversity questions. So that was the third thing. The fourth thing that came out, which is really a good lesson, I think, in the conversation, was the power of thinking about collaborations and ecosystems. It was very, very clear in almost every example that, in fact, some of the things that were working well involved ecosystems that included not just government, but universities, the private sector, as part of the way to think about how to make progress on these issues. And in fact, a fourth and very, very important part of those ecosystem conversations was the importance of including the workers themselves in these conversations. In fact, we all remarked in the sessions that it would have been great to at least have some representation of that in the conversation. And some of the examples that were given show that when in fact the workers themselves are involved, often that leads to some more innovative and interesting solutions. Let me point out the next point that we talked about, which had to do with the fact that as we think about the skilling question, I think there was a very useful framework that Brian McKinsey kind of phrased, which is we should think about different groups of learners and people. There are people who are going to be developers of AI. That's a different group with different challenges, skilling challenges, and people are going to be users of AI. And that's different from the third group, which is probably the largest one, who are going to be the people affected by AI and may never touch it directly themselves. And as we think about these skilling questions, it's worth thinking about each of these 3 groups. And I think the one question, as my 7th point, that kind of left us all kind of without very many good answers, I think was the question of, so how do we do the skilling at scale? Because I think we heard in the room examples about the need to educate 1 million people in one country, a few million people in another country, and there aren't very many examples of kind of reskilling and retraining at very large scale. So how do we do that? And then the final thing, which was a very practical way that we ended up with in many of the discussions, was I think a huge appetite and interest in sharing best practices. I think everybody got something and learned something from something somebody else was doing. I think it was quite helpful having innovators, including, for example, Taxify, which is one of Estonia's unicorns, entrepreneurs in the room, policymakers in the room, government leaders in the room. That diversity, I think, led to a lot of learnings and best practices that I think people wanted to share. That's a quick summary from our sessions.
The two sessions that I had the pleasure to facilitate, we focused on the use of AI in government, or to use Prime Minister Ratas' words, on using AI, on how we could use AI to improve people's lives and deliver better public services. And likewise, there was a lot of agreement around the need to build these AI systems with trust and legitimacy built in from the start. I'm not sure we quite solved the problem of how to code love into the algorithms, but certainly trust and legitimacy needs to be in there right from the beginning. And the words one of the delegates used was to say we need to do this with and for citizens rather than to citizens, which strikes me as a key point. We heard a couple of really striking specific examples where this technology is already in use. We heard an example from Germany where an AI system is in use in the refugee system for a couple of different applications. One is to determine people's accents and pinpoint where they might come from. Another one is to process asylum applications faster than we could do manually. We heard an interesting example from the Republic of Korea that uses artificial intelligence to identify high-risk cargo loads and identify areas that are at highest risk of pollution. And then finally, we heard an example from Sweden, from Stockholm, that's using artificial intelligence to detect children with learning difficulties with a really brief 2-minute test that allows us to detect these children and give them the help and the support they need much earlier than we might be able to otherwise. There was a shared sense that interesting and impressive though these examples might be, we've clearly barely scratched the surface. And one thing we desperately need is this sharing of information and this sharing of these examples and use cases, because everyone felt that while there is experimentation going on, it was very difficult to find out and learn from others what was happening. In closing, a couple of challenges and a big opportunity. The one big challenge that came up was this dearth of information about what's happening out there. Another question was the reliance on vendors. How much of this can we do ourselves versus how much do we need to contract out? And what does that mean when we contract out core bits of government? There was also a large concern around inclusivity and making sure that not just different languages, but different domain experts are represented. The other group that has to be in this conversation are the domain experts, the educators, the social workers, the people that we build these algorithms with and for, and who need to work with them and understand them. There's a big opportunity, it seems. Someone likened the use of artificial intelligence in government to the Apollo project of the 21st century. And this relates to the question of skill and talent and how we get people into government to do this. Because if there's one thing that many people crave, it's the opportunity to do meaningful work. And what could be more meaningful than work on the Apollo project of the 21st century?
Well, I've got all the bad news and all the way that AI is going to, break all of our human rights rules and kill us. No, but seriously, actually, the messages even there were somewhat positive. There was a real strong will in the discussion on AI safety and security and responsible use to get this stuff right. And I think a recognition that, and we looked at a lot of the topics we heard on the main stage here, yes, we have to deal with them, but we need to deal with them while pushing the adoption. And the best way to deal with these questions is to actually be using the technology. So if you actually cut off your hands and don't let yourself play with this and experiment with this and use it, you hurt yourself in the long run. There was also recognition that we're not talking about raising awareness or a hypothetical set of concerns, there's already a lot of regulation out there that deals with human rights in AI, that deals with ethics in AI. On something like self-driving cars, we've gotten quite far along the road on regulating all of this. There are some open issues. In particular, we had some interesting back and forth discussions on how to deal with the question of liability. And not everyone agrees there. There are different concepts. But there are quite a few international processes that are going on, but they're going on in silos. So we've got a human rights and an ethics process. We've got a process on AI when it comes to its use in autonomous weapons. We've got the discussions on self-driving cars. But we're talking about the same technology, the same product design, the same societies using them. So we need to try and bring these communities together and try and bridge some of the silos. So some of the observations maybe on the AI itself, first of all, is that we really have a dual set of problems when we talk about responsible use of AI. We have the fact that AI is sometimes still quite incompetent, and we have a tendency to sort of put too much faith into AI, and a lot of the ethical misuse that we have are actually come from people sort of blindly trusting the AI when they should have more controls in place. But we also need to be ready for the AI being a bit too competent at times, carrying out cyber attacks that we can't defend against, manipulating our own emotions. Certainly that's come up in the fake news discussion and is going to get worse with things like deep fakes. And you know, there was some lack of comfort around the whole Terminator, sci-fi type of scenarios. People don't know how to orient themselves around that. On the one hand, you know, there's a sense we should be responsible. We shouldn't go out there and preach messages of doom and gloom. But there's also recognition that having that in the background actually motivates the discussion and gets people to the table. There are also effects from using AI that don't come directly from the AI-ness of the technology, but simply are emergent results from automating a lot of things. I mean, if you have a whole lot more in the way of IoT out there and automated systems, you can hack that. The hack may have nothing to do with AI, but a self-driving car can be hacked in a way that a human being driving a car just can't be. And so, at the end of the day, the real challenge for policymakers is not to become aware of this problem or to recognize a difficulty. It's to handle the complexity. It's how do you orient yourself when you have all these different sources of advice, all these different communities telling you have an issue. How do you figure out when to regulate, when to leave things to the market? We didn't have any clear answers there today, but we did have some ideas. One thing that we realized is that skills really matter. And we were talking concretely about the skills and the awareness of policymakers and the companies to orient themselves to these problems. The skills is not just this generic question of, you know, do we have the training around the technology, but also do we have the policy understanding, and do we have the right people in the right place, especially in government, to react quickly? Explainability matters too. And again, we're not just talking about the narrow academic discipline of AI explainability, which can be quite difficult, but also this broader sense of can we explain to policymakers, can we explain to our citizens what's going on, even if we may not have an AI that is in a technical sense explainable. So there was a lot of support for the idea we heard here on the main stage of some kind of an observatory, better tracking, more data. There are also institutions out there doing that. There are new NGOs around AI, but there are a lot of other organizations that are tracked with being human rights observatories, you know, being observatories around trade, around law of armed conflict. Let's get those existing organizations, those sources of funding, to worry about AI. And above all, let's go forward on this together. Now, the countries we've got around the table here are, broadly speaking, the countries that care about the ethical and the responsible use of AI. And not everyone necessarily prioritizes that concern as highly, to be diplomatic about it. If we want the whole world to look the way we want it to look 10 or 15 years from now, we need to be good at articulating our vision, and we need to put that in terms that mean something to companies, that mean something to countries across the world. So we need to be able to, as consumers, and as countries and regulators and as companies, actually create demand for products and services that are responsible, that respect the principles that our societies care about. And that means that the types of discussions we have here need to go forward. They need to go into very concrete international processes. And I think we recognize that we're starting on this road here. In particular, we need to bring the different regional discussions together. I come from a background where we've talked, where I know what's going on very well in Europe. I'm not as actively aware of what's going on in, say, East Asia, in North and South America. We need to bridge these regional silos. The bad news is there's going to be a negative CO2 impact from all the flying, but the good news is that we can try and bring us all together. And I guess that's it for the three of us.
Yeah, I think so.
Back to you. Thanks.